Welcome to Best Minds in Association, brought to you by Colorado Society of Association Executives. I'm your host, Heather Toon, today. And with me, I have Brian Scott with Clear Tone Consulting. Brian, this is a second in a three-part series. So talk to me about all things internet and security and my goodness, everything I don't know that keeps me anxious.
Happy to do it. I'm one of those strange fellows that love to talk about security. But by the way, I have to call out that I love the fact that your name and my company name both have something in common. Heather Toon in Clear Tone. I love it. So but I digress, because don't get me started on music, right? So to recap, as you mentioned, this is the second one. Just briefly, what we talked about in the first one, if you missed it, was what's going on in the world, right? Why is cybersecurity exploding? That's all the news you see is it's more. And there's a couple of reasons for that, right? But one of the, or there's several reasons for that, but one of the things that I think is really important for associations, and this has changed over time, is that phishing, the common email phishing that everyone thinks, yeah, I know about phishing, but still, that's 90% of the attack vectors of the incidents that occur. 90% of them come through phishing, start with phishing. That's no small thing. I mean, that basically means that is the frontline battle of cybersecurity right there, is in phishing. And why that's important? Well, so let's add a couple more things to that. Why is phishing so popular with hackers? Well, one thing, it's just so easy to do. I mean, it's just sending emails, right? And they can automate that process of sending emails. It's not like they're sitting there typing emails, and they have bots and they're using AI, and it's all an automate. It's like a factory. I mean, they're just pumping this stuff out, right? They're very sophisticated in that way. And even more interestingly, to associations particularly, 65% of all of that phishing, so a large majority, 2/3 of the phishing that's going on, is called spear phishing, which means they know someone's name and they're impersonating them. They're saying, hey, I'm John Doe, I'm the president of the company, with John Doe being the company president, please, do this for me. So they know something about these companies. And that's why I think that's so interesting to the association, because what does an association have? They have a database of all of the who's who for any given vertical, right?
We covered that last time, because
right.
We were like, well, what do I have?
Right, exactly. And so it's very of interest to them. And so that's what's going on. And what that means is that it puts a lot of responsibility on the individual in every organization, right? So we'll talk about that. So that's what we kind of went on. That's really what's going on out there that's made this such a big issue. Yeah. And so when I work with customers that really want to understand their risk position and their security position as a whole around their data, I describe what I call the three-headed dragon in this space, and that's security, cybersecurity, specifically privacy and ownership. You have to kind of pay attention to all three of them if you really want to protect and understand what's going on with these data assets that people have. On the security side, which we were talking about, phishing and the cybersecurity side, but to get back to the individual, the responsibility of the individual, they call that now in the security field out there, the human firewall. So most people have heard about firewalls, right? And there are like, appliance devices that you put on the end of your networks that are facing the internet, and they really do the hard lifting of trying to protect, all of the garbage that's going on out there and the hackers. And so they're your frontline warrior to your network, right? Well, but we didn't say that 90% of all the attacks are coming through your network. Right? So firewalls are doing a pretty good job, right? Because there's a small percentage that are actually getting through that. If you set them up correctly and really tune them and stay on top of them, they're really effective. He said 90% are coming through the front door, which is not the back door, the front door, which is through people. And so that's the concept of the human firewall. An association and any organization's staff really need to understand that is a significant responsibility that they share now. And think about it. Most people don't really understand and own that. Like, oh, it's like it's 100% my responsibility to keep this organization's information safe.
And that's
It's
a
always
big responsibility.
it is, yeah.
Especially if you're not being trained right or
yeah,
appropriately. And how do we do that? I guess, like, where do you start? Because everybody has a different grasp of what this looks like.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question, and you have to train. I mean, otherwise we're not giving our staff the proper skills, right? We're kind of setting them up to fail if we don't do that. So there's several systems out there that are really aimed at this problem, and one's called Know Before. It's the most popular one, knowbefore.com. And what it does is that it's very easy to set up. Doesn't take IT professionals to really do this, but any IT folks can help you with it. But it sets up these campaigns that send your staff fake phishing emails, right? And on purpose, right? And it sends it to them, trying to get them to either click on a link, that goes somewhere, and maybe even enter some credentials. Like the phishing email might be posing like it's HR or IT. Hey, we need to do something, but we need your credentials, right? And so, go enter it in, or download and open up an attachment. Those are the two things that are really risky. Well, it sets all of these fake ones up, and it has a huge library, like literally like 10,000 fake emails, that it can use from the likes of Amazon, and Uber and Airbnb, Microsoft, and your own HR department, right? It'll actually kind of spoof your own HR department. And so it sends it out to your staff, and then it collects, well, who's clicking, right? And those that click or fail the test automatically are enrolled in video training, right? So then and they have all of that video training there, and you can go through it. It's great. It's really a wonderful system. So that's a have to. I mean, you have to be doing that. If you're not doing that, then that's like the lowest level, right? Then there's some other things that can be done too, for groups. And this is a great thing for individuals personally. I use this, but there's some other sites, like one's called urlvoid.com that I use. And so if you ever get an email and you're pondering it and you're thinking, well, actually, I think this might be real, but I'm not sure. Maybe it's it's posing from a new vendor that you just set up something, but you've not talked to them before. You're like, well, I'm not really sure. Well, you can actually just take that link, copy that link, and go to that website and put it in, and it'll check the link out for you. It'll say, is this a safe link? Is there anything malicious? Have there been reports of malicious activity from this site? All of that stuff, right? So there's lots of tools. There's lots of training tools, and there's but people need to know about them. So that's where the training comes in.
So you had, I don't want to interrupt you, but I do, because I'm interested. Please. You were saying that they can spoof things from HR and inside your own company, which is terrifying, because, if it's a vendor like Amazon, I never click on anything. Like Amazon is always updating their emails. Like I just got one the other day about my package. I was like, this is weird. I've not seen this before. Let me go log into Amazon. So I'll go to Amazon and log in versus clicking anything in emails. But if it's somebody that you think in your HR, in your building, you can, how are you going to, how can you be effective if you're constantly having to check, like, hey, Bill, did you send this? Hey, Jean, did you send this?
Yeah. Well, the first trigger is that you have to think about, what are they asking you to do? And does it really make sense, right? And if it has anything to do with either your credentials or money, it probably is worth a double check, right? So it's one of the most biggest reasons that spear phishing is so popular. They want to get the CFO or the CEO's name, and then they go directly into the accounting group and send emails to them asking them to wire money somewhere, right? I worked at a company that fell prey to this. Literally, I saw the whole thing happen. How they did it is they actually got a domain. This company's name had two I's in it, with other letters, obviously, and they got a domain that when next to one of the I's, it had two I's, with the rest of the word. And so at first glance, your eye just doesn't really pick it up, right? It's just that's the same domain, but it's not. And so they spoofed the president of the company and asked to wire lots of money somewhere, and it happened. So you do really have to be very discerning. It never hurts to reach out through a different means. Lots of times we're using IM tools today, like Teams or Slack or something, right? And so if someone asks you to do something through email that has something to do with money or personal information, and you're not exactly sure, it might just be a little out of the blue, then why not just shoot them an IM? Say, hey, just got that, just confirming that you want me to do that. Yep, that's me. So that's great. It's an easy way to do it.
I want to go back to your email trick, because I used to, if I wasn't sure, I would click on their name, because sometimes they show up as name and not their email. And if I saw weird, all these weird things, I was like, okay, this is not right, delete. Or I would respond and then check the email and go, okay, this isn't the same person. But that's interesting that they're now spoofing or getting a very similar website that upon like first glance, you're like, oh yeah, this is right.
Yeah.
So,
and
good tip.
They do that. And, another thing they do is there's another reason they're trying to get people's credentials is because they actually want to send other emails from that person's account. Right. And so it might really be from the account. If the president's account was compromised and that he doesn't know it, then it's going to be an email from his account. Right. Which is even more dangerous. So yeah, it's a crazy world out there. So let's move on into privacy a little bit, because we've kind of talked about security quite a bit. Privacy it's the next wave, and it's already a pretty big wave. It's actually multiple waves that are coming into the business world that we have to contend with. Not that we don't already have our hands full with the security side of it, but now we have to worry about privacy. And
sure,
I support this because I think conceptually, of course, I think we all want to be in charge of our own information about us electronically. Makes sense. It's a great thing to do. So GDPR, most people have heard about that. And it's, from the EU, it's the law that is protecting EU citizens' rights to their data, regardless of who's using that. So I think most associations, have moved beyond this, but some of them thought, well, we're not doing our meetings are not in the EU, or but they still have some international folks that are members. It still applies to them because it's applying to the individual, not where the organization is holding, say, either events or other things like that. And so they kind of got the ball rolling, and they had some pretty stiff fines that they threw out there, some big dollars that were pretty scary. But the United States is catching up. We've already had California and Virginia were the first two. Colorado, interestingly, given this podcast and the group that this is for, was the third state to pass legislation around privacy. There are a lot of similarities between all of these programs, and they're almost all really, you can only align them with GDPR. It was the first one, and they did a pretty comprehensive job, and so they're almost all the same. Now, none of the states carry the obvious fines clear fines that are so large as the GDPR, right? So that's good, in some ways, but it's still a law on the books. And I think what that means is that probably a little bit more risk at your brand tarnishing, right? If you fail, if something comes out and you're not following good privacy rules, and that got out into your marketplace somehow, that's probably the bigger risk than an actual financial recourse to that. But there are 19 more states that have bills in legislation right now. I mean, it's going to be, and eventually we're going to have a federal law with that.
And I will find that law and for Colorado and post it in the show notes, so that if you want to dive deep into that, you can.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, one of the it's not luckily, although you need to understand it and there are things to do, it's not nearly as scary and comprehensive as security is. It's manageable. But But I would certainly advise that any association, have their lawyers engaged on the concept of privacy and what they ought to do, so that they're getting counsel, because this is a law, right? It's not an IT, protocol. It's a law that we have to meet. The biggest thing is, I think that where it really all starts is all about consent, right? Is stating to your maybe association members or your customers, right, for an organization, you have to state why you're collecting the data, what data you're collecting, and what you intend to do with it. And that, if you do that well and you communicate it well and upfront, and you give them an option to decide to not do something if they don't want to do that, then you're almost, I'd say, 80% there, right, already, because that's the biggest thing. It's really around being upfront. A lot of these state laws also only apply to organizations that are dealing with certain amounts of data, like you have to have it over a certain threshold of data, or organizations that sell data for profit. And I don't think that many, if any, associations actually do that, right?
No, but there is a group that's always trying to sell, like, I'm sure you've seen it, where it's like, oh, the 2022 Curtin Association's meeting, click here or email me to get the list. And you're like, and some people fall for that, or even email the association saying, I didn't do that, like, I didn't say that you could do this. And it's like, we're not selling anything, I promise you. Yeah. So we always told our attendees ahead of time, like, hey, you may get an email like this, promise we're not selling any data. So just know that.
That's a big problem in the association and the meeting space, particularly in the trade show and convention space. I mean, every one of those organizations and events are plagued by that, data pirates, trying to do that. It puts another onus of education and communication on the organization, right, to their members about what they will and what they won't do, and that exists out there. Yeah. It's sad, but it's certainly a state of the world that we're in. A couple other things around privacy that I think make sense as well, but that are easy enough to really deal with, is one of the things that came out of GDPR that these other state laws have, is that an individual has the right to be forgotten. They have the right to be able to call, connect with, and call up an association and say, I don't want you to have my data anymore. Like, if I'm done, I'm not going to be part of your, your association or whatever. And that's okay. All you have to do, you can do it. You can deal with that issue manually. You don't have to automate systems and like just to hit a button and somehow, make their data disappear, because that would be very expensive, right? But as long as your IT group has a plan for if that occurs, these are the steps we're going to go through. And the laws give you time to do it, and it doesn't have to be immediately. So all we're talking about really is just having a plan in place on how to deal with that. So that's pretty easy.
With that, because I know a lot of associations keep that data for historical reasons. No, I will never reach out to you. Would a suggestion be to change that name so that you have like the payment data, and that you have the communication data, that like maybe name it John or Jane Doe and 1234 Main Street or something?
Exactly. It's called anonymization, right?
Okay.
So you anonymize the data. Yeah. Because your systems actually might even break if you actually delete someone's data, because maybe they had lots of purchases and there's all these other things they're connected to, right? And so you do need to have a plan to anonymize it. And you're exactly right. It's just BrianScott might turn into user one, last name one, and you get rid of the address and things like that. Okay. But that's a good segue into the next part of privacy that complicates it a little bit more. And that is, you do need to really have it mapped out and have a clear understanding of the processors and vendors that you're using that might also be dealing with this data that you're the steward of. You're responsible for taking care of this data, right? And so if you do get a call from someone that says, I'm going to exercise my right to be forgotten, it's not just maybe the association system, right? They are like, oh, that data we've actually shared with these 4 different vendors who are our processors, and we need to get that request down to them as well, right? They also have to be comply with this law, right, and have this privacy compliance. So they should be prepared as well to take those requests and say, yep, we know how to anonymize and we'll anonymize. So it kind of goes through the entire system. So just something to think about, that because most associations, almost all associations, use vendors to some degree,
Sure.
dealing with their data, right? So it's not, they don't hold it all themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last part of the three-headed dragon is ownership. And this is interesting, but very important, because actually what we're talking about in privacy is that associations don't actually even really own that data, right? They're stewards of the data.
Mm-hmm.
And what these laws are saying, and these laws are saying that individuals own their data, but they're allowing you to hold on to it and take care of it, is what they're doing. All right, so at least from that perspective, though, the association kind of owns that right to be good stewards with this data. And so when they engage in with third-party organizations and vendors to help them, run their business and provide very valuable services, I'm sure, to these members, it's all good. But they need to truly understand who's claiming rights to any of this data that's being shared. Something interesting just happened in the virtual event space, the virtual meetings that obviously with COVID exploded in the association and the work world as a whole. Lots of virtual event platforms popped up seemingly overnight. We went from probably like having 20 or 30 different platforms to well over 300, within say 6 months. And so they all had these contracts. And they're many pages deep, and somewhere buried in those contracts somewhere is going to be a clause about data ownership. And so if someone with a privacy and data ownership mindset is not really looking for that, like maybe if it's just the lawyers that might be reviewing it, they may not, depending on who your counsel is, maybe they weren't thinking about that particular part of it, right? What we discovered is that there were a bunch of associations out there that ended up signing some contracts with some of these vendors, and those vendors had joint data ownership clauses in it. So like once you use our system and your people come through it, we have rights to that data, right? That was a pretty big shock when that came to light, right? I think it's shocking from two perspectives. One, I'm sure it was a shock for the organization, right? That the association, like, oh my gosh, we didn't mean to do that. Yeah. Shocking to me, thinking that someone signed a contract without fully reviewing it to that level, right?
Yeah, but I mean, sometimes it's hundreds of pages. And so how would you, what are some key words or key terms maybe that we should be looking for in that information?
So one thing is I would do is the word data, right? I mean, I'll search first thing I'll search through is data. Anywhere they're talking about data, I want to know what they're talking about, right? Okay. Luckily most of it is legalese about other things, right? And not data. So it's not like there's, hundreds and hundreds of mentions of that. It's usually pretty limited. So that's the most common one. I'd say data, ownership. Other things like aggregate is a good word, and metadata is another one to look for, but data will catch that one, right? But because lots of times organizations will say, well, the data is yours, but we own the right to aggregate. Anonymized is another thing, aggregate, anonymized, and metadata around that. And that's worth, if you catch that, it's worth a conversation. So like with the vendor, say, tell me exactly what you're doing with this, and what kind of, when you say you're anonymizing it, how are you anonymizing? What are you getting rid of? Are you keeping, is it just the name, but are you keeping their address, their full mailing address, with their email, and so kind of get into the details of that, because you really want to have an understanding of what data you're allowing them legally to have rights to. Okay. That's the three-headed beast.
Wow.
It's a lot.
What a beast. Do you guys go to night school to be able to tackle them?
I would hope not.
Yes, but thank you for all the great information. Every time I get off the phone with you, my head hurts, in a good way. It's growing. My brain is growing, but it's just things that you would never think about, right? Because for me personally, when I'm going through an app, buying an app or signing up for a website, I'm like, oh, thousands of other people are doing this. Okay. Because I'm not going to read 175 pages of
Yeah, I know that is tough. It's one of the problems that we have right now. It really is. Even when you provide consent, who's going to read it?
Yeah.
So it is a tough situation, but we can't. And there's so much. I don't have any really advice how to fix that side of it. But my advice, obviously, to customers is really just how to protect themselves, right? The organization, right? And how to provide um, transparency, which builds trust for their brand, right, to their customers and members, right?
Yeah. And you've given us a lot of hints on how to cut it off when we need to cut it off. And I love those websites that you gave us. It's so fascinating that somebody was like, I can teach these people about it and make money.
Yeah. Well, I hope it's helpful for you and all of your listeners.
Oh, I think so. Thank you so much again, Brian. And we have a third part of this conversation coming up next month. So stay tuned.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
All right. Bye. Brian's information will be in the show notes as well. So if you need to reach out to him.
Thanks.
Until next time.